Good morning, guys.
Morning.
So I hit you with a bunch of stuff last time on domestic policy, mainly economic policy. Do you have any questions about that? I hope it was useful info. I want to continue and likely finish on economic policy today and social welfare policy, and maybe start on foreign policy. The reason I was a couple minutes late is, believe it or not, I was working on the foreign policy presentation, and I don't want you to think that these presentations are simply rehashed stuff from 4 years ago. They're not. And I was updating the presentation on foreign policy so that I could conclude with a rather unconventional, which doesn't mean it's wrong, discussion of the release of the Senate Intelligence Committee's release of a report on American torture in the past, well, since 9/11. You will see in that characteristically I am critical of everybody, at least what everybody is saying, and giving you another way to think about it. If you haven't read anything about it and it's just new news from yesterday, you might want to take a look at Google News and find an article from the Washington Post or New York Times and read about it. But we're going to continue on economic policy and then social welfare policy. So we left off talking about fiscal and monetary policy, and one of the things to keep in mind is that different institutions, different governmental institutions, make fiscal and monetary policy. We already talked about this. The Congress makes fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve and the Open Market Committee make monetary policy. These two institutions are not coordinated. And so one can conclude that to the degree that economic policy is largely a function of fiscal policy and monetary policy, that federal economic policy is not coherent or managed in an efficient and consistent manner, regardless of which party controls the White House or which party or parties control the bodies in Congress. You have different institutions making policy. And there are different kinds of economic policies, as we've already discussed. And in fact, if you, within the past year, Ben Bernanke, who is chairman of a Princeton economist who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, stepped down within the past year. If you go back and you read his testimony and public statements, his testimony to Congress and his public statements, you'll see that he pleaded with the Congress to no avail to change its fiscal policy in a way to be more supportive of economic growth. Congress chose not to listen. Okay, so I want to talk again about fiscal policy. Here's the importance of fiscal policy, or taxing and spending. And this really emerges out of the and in response to the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was an economist named John Maynard Keynes, and he developed at the time an approach to economic policy in response to severe economic decline or depression. Keynes believed, in my view correctly, that a capitalist economy is cyclical, it has its ups and downs, and that its fatal weakness is underconsumption, or put differently, too little demand. That is to say that people won't spend enough. People won't buy enough goods and services. That could be for any number of reasons. One of which might be they don't have enough money, or that they're very concerned about the future of the economy, and so they don't want to spend because they want to keep more cash. But another reason that there may be too little demand is that capitalism may produce more than people can consume. So this is a problem of overproduction. What happens if in an economy there's so much produced because businesses and workers are so productive and the technology is so productive and increasing productivity over time that simply too much is produced? So that's another side of the economic problem coin, so to speak, that Keynes talked about. There could be too little demand, there can be too much production of goods and services, and these help account for the ebb and flow, the ups and downs, the booms and busts of an economy. So what happens when manufacturers or producers can't sell their goods or can't sell all their goods? Well, their profits will tend to decline and their inventories will expand because they couldn't sell the goods and they have a surplus. And what happens when they have a surplus? They reduce production, they reduce investment, and they reduce the number of employees because they don't need to produce, the business doesn't need to produce as much quote-unquote stuff as it did previously because businesses still have these high inventories. And this is one way that economic decline can begin. So those who follow the policy approach of Keynes argue that there needs to be some combination of economic policies to stimulate economic growth in cases of economic decline, recession, and depression. What are those policies? Government spending must be increased. New public works must be built. People must be employed through government projects if necessary in order to prevent excessive and underemployment. And taxes must be cut for those who have the least spending power in the economy. The idea behind this approach, this policy approach, is to pump money into the economy when it's in decline, and then to take some money out through taxes when it is booming excessively. So the idea of Keynesian economic policy is to use government policy to promote what's called counter-cyclical policy in order to try to maintain a stable prosperity. The idea is to try to not eliminate the boom and bust, or the cycles, but because that's really impossible, but to use economic policy to lessen their severity and to create as much as possible a relatively stable economic prosperity. So when necessary, policy should help the little guy and stimulate demand. When necessary, it should raise taxes on those who are most likely to spend, which is upper income people, to prevent excessive and unsustainable economic growth. So Keynesianism really is a not too hot, not too cold, Goldilocks and the Three Bears approach to economic policy. We don't want a horrible recession or depression. We don't want excessive booming economic growth. We want a kind of stable prosperity. Easy to say, hard to achieve. So we talked about monetary policy earlier. This is just a revisiting of that. And those who argue that there are those who argue that monetary policy as a way to manage the economy or to prevent, to maintain a relatively stable prosperity works better with monetary policy than fiscal policy. And the argument, and by the way, the policy mandate of the Federal Reserve is to try to maintain stable 2% inflation over time and unemployment around 5% with steady economic growth. So this is the policy mandate of the Federal Reserve, which is consistent with a kind of Keynesian approach. Okay, not huge inflation, not relatively modest unemployment, steady growth. How monetarists get there, that is those who argue for monetary policy as being more important than fiscal policy, is they get there different ways. So this is again a replay of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve Board focuses on the cost of money. Simply put, as we talked about last time, if money is cheap, people will borrow and spend. If money is more expensive, they will borrow less, and thus the level of economic activity will drop. So monetarists, those who argue for the importance of interest rates as a way to manage economic growth, are skeptical about the effectiveness of fiscal policy, that is to say taxing and spending by Congress, as a way to manage the economy. They doubt that governments can move quickly enough to apply the appropriate policy for the situation. You know enough about Congress to know there's some merit to this argument. Congress doesn't move quickly. And when it does, frankly, it's probably a bad sign too. Congress doesn't move quickly. Congress doesn't do things quickly, almost all the time. So monetarists argue that inflation can be controlled and the economy and its prosperity can be maintained better through changes in monetary policy. They believe by regulating the supply and cost of money, that is interest rates, the Fed can more effectively maintain a stable economy. And it normally takes, this is the conventional wisdom, once there are changes in the cost of money or interest rates, most economists assume it takes about 9 months for that increase in interest rates or decrease, whichever it is, to take effect. In a situation now where we have very low interest rates, the argument essentially is this: in a situation of low interest rates, once interest rates start to increase a little bit, that may actually incentivize people to borrow more in anticipation that the cost of money in the future will be even higher. And that argument is often made, for example, with regard to the housing market. When mortgages are, when interest rates begin to rise, the argument is that people will actually go out and buy more homes because they fear that mortgage rates are going to go up additionally in the future. So as I said, economic policy is not well coordinated simply because you've got different political institutions that are making economic policy. The point of economic policy, it seems to me, should be to meet the needs of the American people. It's about whether or not we'll have good jobs, adequate public goods and services, decent health care and benefits, opportunities to build good careers, and adequate resources during retirement for us and our parents. As we've already suggested in earlier classes, we often talk about economic policy, foreign policy, housing policy, environmental policy, and so on, as though they're separate and distinct and unrelated. They are often made that way, but the world and American government doesn't work that way. These things are interrelated and intertwined, even though we act as though they're not. And one of the reasons governments can't make, or our government and most governments have difficulty making good policy, is because policy is treated in an incremental and not a comprehensive way. So where are we today on economic policy? Well, the key context really was the meltdown of the American and the world economy in the last year of the Bush administration. Most observers would argue that the United States recovery, economic recovery, has been slower than most economic recoveries in the past, and that recovery is even slower in the rest of the world. One reason ours seems to be not quite so bad is the Fed's monetary policy has been highly stimulative. That is, the Federal Reserve Board has kept interest rates very low, making it very easy for many, and certainly many businesses, to borrow and banks to lend, and for people to use credit and loans in order to engage in more rather than less economic activity. On the other hand, Congress and its fiscal policy in the last 4 years has prevented a more robust economic recovery. This is not me talking. This is the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, among others, Ben Bernanke, because it took no action on jobs, no action on infrastructure maintenance and development, no action on immigration, and no action on increasing the progressivity of the tax system. On all of these, I'll just make a brief comment. Why are jobs important? Jobs are important in terms of economic policy. Narrowly here, jobs are important for a huge number of reasons. But in economic terms, for the federal government, the reason jobs are important is because if everybody is working, they're also engaged and they're also spending the money that they earn, and they're also paying taxes on that money. If unemployment is very high, then the revenues that the government is going to get are going to be lower, and the demand in the economy is going to be lower. Infrastructure development is important because people have to get to work. Goods have to be moved. If roadways, if trains, if airlines and airports, bridges, if none of these things, with water systems don't work, all of the infrastructure really can't sustain, a failing infrastructure can't sustain robust economic growth. And in fact, the National Organization of Civil Engineers has given the United States government a D+ on maintaining the infrastructure. I don't know if you can graduate with D+, but our economy can't function like it's supposed to on a D+ infrastructure. Immigration is important because what the research shows as an issue that needs to be addressed. What research shows is that the expansion or the increase in population actually has a positive effect on economic growth. And keep in mind that the birth rate in the United States is relatively low. And that's often the case for a number of highly developed, very developed countries in the world. So bringing more people into the country, increasing population, actually has, all of the things equal, the impact of improving economic growth. And finally, if poverty is a problem, And inequality, excessive inequality, is a problem. What that means is a larger and larger percentage of the population has essentially no discretionary income and not enough income. And so what happens when people have very little income? They can't spend. And if they can't spend, they can't buy goods, they can't buy services. And so that poses a drag on the economy. Any comments on economic policy or questions?
No.
Did I hear someone?
No.
Okay. We're going to move on to social welfare policy. First of all, it's important to know where social welfare programs came from. And where they came from in the modern world was Bismarck's Germany. And Bismarck's rule in Germany ended in 1890. And he was actually a political conservative, and he ruled for a number of decades. And he looked around and he said, you know, I'm kind of concerned about Germany because I got a lot of people who are destitute here, and this is a source of disorder and problems in our society. And we need to do something to provide for people who are in really disadvantaged circumstances, simply as a matter, if not humanitarian intent, simply to see that the social order and the political community remain intact. In the American context, some 40 plus years later, the Great Depression led President Franklin Roosevelt to begin the establishment of a number of social welfare programs. Things like Social Security, things like unemployment insurance, things like public works programs. Note that these programs, Social Security, unemployment insurance, were programs that only benefited those who work, those who are employed. Simply put, you can't get unemployment insurance if you've never been employed. You can't get unemployment insurance if you've never been employed. You can't get Social Security, at least as a pension, once you turn retirement age, unless you worked, or unless someone who's worked in your family, like a parent, has died, or a few other situations as well. But generally speaking, these initial programs were oriented toward either putting people to work or benefiting people who had worked. And so one of the impacts of the development of the social welfare state or social welfare programs in the United States is if you look at the distribution of income over time, say between 1933 and 1970, but even longer than that, between 1920 and 1970, the distribution of income amongst the American people remained relatively steady. Why does this matter? It matters, first of all, because social welfare programs, in fact, did exactly what Bismarck hoped. That is, would create relatively stable income distribution. It wouldn't unnecessarily take away or impoverish any group, but rather provide a kind of stability, a kind of economic stability, and a kind of social stability to the society and perhaps to the economy as well. So the social welfare programs cannot reasonably be described as dramatically redistributing money to low-income people from high-income people. Now, in the United States, social welfare programs are of two sorts. One sort is called a contributory program, and this describes unemployment compensation, Medicare, and Social Security. Each of these involves contributions that employees and/or employers make to the program, separate from income tax. So, Social Security and Medicare are the two largest contributory programs, meaning employees over the course of their lives pay into Social Security, pay into Medicare. And in fact, once they turn 65, they still pay into Medicare. And in fact, Social Security is the program in the country, in the United States, most responsible for keeping Americans out of poverty, especially elderly women. One of the things you need to keep in mind is that women tend to earn less than men in the American economy. Overall, somewhere around 77% of what men do. And they face many more barriers than certainly most Caucasian men. And women live longer. And women are more likely to be out of the labor force for, when they're pregnant or what have you. And so the fact that there are more elderly women, go into, if you think I'm crazy, besides looking at the mortality data, which you can do, and you'll see that women live on the average at least 3 more years than men, but go into any retirement home. I've been in a lot in the past couple of years, and what you will see is a substantial majority of elderly women, many fewer men. So, one set of programs are contributory, that is to say, employees all along through the course of their lives pay into specific designated taxes for Social Security, Medicare, and employers for unemployment. Then there are non-contributory programs. These provide health care for low-income and especially elderly people, and modest amounts of various benefits that we'll see, such as food stamps, school lunches, housing and temporary employment assistance, also things like some student grants to lower income people. And these programs have been shifted over time, largely to, not always, but largely to the states. And the states tend, as often as not, to either lack the funds or the incentive to fund them fully. One difference between, with regard to funding social programs, is that the federal government has a power that state governments don't have, which is to say it can print money, which means it can spend money. The Republican majority in the House has passed a budget, in the House of Representatives, has passed a budget that would significantly reduce spending on these non-contributory programs, but it has not become law. Welfare reform was passed in 1996, and this has reduced welfare caseloads and social welfare expenditures, but has not significantly changed the status or the number of most low-income people in the United States. And so now, while most remain poor, the maximum number of years one can be on these non-contributory programs is 5. So, how much does the United States government spend on welfare? This is a chart put together by the developed countries of Europe, primarily. And what it shows is government social welfare spending as a percentage of gross domestic product, that is, as a percentage of the total economic value of what the economy produces. And what you can see is the United States lags significantly the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Sweden, among other countries, in social spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. So in terms of education, social welfare, Social Security, retirement, unemployment compensation, food and nutrition assistance, aid for kids, and so on, we're doing less well, or spending less, certainly, than almost half as much as a percentage of gross domestic product as Germany, France, and Sweden, and about, 2/3 of what is spent in the United Kingdom. We talked about the non-contributory programs. This figure looks at 2013 for social welfare programs for low-income people that exclude health care programs. These are this is the non-contributory piece of social welfare. So you can see that the largest is for 26.9% is for child nutrition and WIC, and has to do with food aid. Second largest is refundable tax credits. This is largely the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, that low-income people can take advantage of. Roughly one of every $6 is in education and training. That could be like Pell Grants, for example, or school lunch programs, that kind of thing. SSI is for largely disabled people, 12.4%. That's roughly one of every $8. Housing assistance, roughly 1/9, and so on. So this is where non-health related spending goes for low-income people. You can see that the big chunk of it, almost 27% and 17.5%, go to almost 50% go to people under 18, and the 20.5% is going to go to households. And 1 of 4 kids in the country lives in a poor household. So the majority of this, and of course foster care, child care, etc., TANF, that also goes largely to benefit children. So most of the beneficiaries of low-income, non-health related programs are either our children under 18, and the SSI is going to be largely disabled people. And in fact, that's what this figure 1 shows as of entitlement benefits. Most go to elderly, the majority goes to elderly people, 1 of every $5 to disabled people, and 18% going to those working households that are neither elderly nor disabled. So basically, most of the 2/3, almost 3/4 of entitlement benefit spending goes to people who are either disabled or as old as your grandparents or older. Here's an example, another figure. This is from 2010 from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that shows that the major income group that benefits most from entitlement benefits is middle income people. Nobody knows this. Most people say, "Oh, the government never did anything for me. I never got social welfare programs." Oh, excuse me, you're totally mistaken. The major beneficiaries of, and this is why the programs have existed, the major beneficiaries of entitlement benefits have been people who work more or less regularly and are middle income. Not poor people, not rich people, middle-income people. This includes things like, being able to write off your mortgage. This includes education assistance, Social Security, Medicare, all kinds of things. So, and this is all based on government data. It's not anything I'm making up. So, a tax on social welfare programs, efforts to cut social welfare programs, entitlement benefits, are in effect going to most dramatically affect, if they're passed, middle-income Americans. So there's been a good bit of talk lately, though no real action, on the problem of extreme inequality. I suppose the only action that one could say has been taken is action by the president and some cities and states with regard to raising the minimum wage. And I want to suggest there are at least three arguments, probably more, but I'm going to give you three, in defense of social programs and in defense of greater tax progressivity. That is to say, taxing wealthier people more than lower income people. I might add, by the way, I am in the wealthier people category. The moral argument is that at a relatively low cost, we can prevent literally tens of millions of Americans from suffering unnecessarily. Whether it's lack of food, housing, decent education, access to health care, it really doesn't cost us that much in the big scheme of things to do this. And in so doing, we can actually make people's lives a lot better. The economic argument is that public policies that increase the spending power of households and persons with lower incomes will improve economic growth more than policies that don't, because lower income households will spend the additional money. Why will they spend the money? Because currently low-income households have little, usually no, discretionary income and have basic needs that remain unmet. So if you're a low-income person and all of a sudden you come into, say, $1,000 extra over the course of a year, say a tax credit or whatever, chances are you're not going to put it into your investment account and buy, 20 shares of Apple computer. Not that you could buy 20 shares for $1,000. Rather, you're going to spend it on the needs that your family has that you've not been able to meet in the past. And that money then circulates because you're buying stuff. That stuff has to be made by somebody. Somebody is selling it. They're probably going to make a little bit of money selling it to you. That means they're going to be able to employ people to sell it to you, and so on. The political argument against extreme inequality is that excessive, and this is an argument that's been going on for well over 250 years, is that excessive inequality destroys political equality. You and I are not political equals to the Koch brothers or to somebody with that kind of money. Yes, our vote might be equal, but we are not political equals because they have not only a position in the society and in the economy, but the money necessary to influence public policy and political officials in ways that we do not. And one can raise the question, and it's certainly been raised many times by political observers and political thinkers, if inequality is very, very extreme, and it is in the United States compared to other developed countries, is it possible to have a democratic society and a democratic political system? If I have one vote and somebody else has the equivalent of 50,000 votes. I think there's at least a case to be made that, in fact, that's no longer a democracy. And so that's a problem. And one way reducing inequality has at least offers the possibility of reducing the likelihood that political inequality becomes the basis of our political order. Are there comments or questions at this point?
What do you feel about raising the minimum wage?
Well, I support it, but the main argument against it has been that it will actually cause more people to be unemployed. I don't think that's an argument. I don't think that's a serious argument. The difficulty I have with that policy, and even though I support it, is that it really doesn't change anything fundamental in the economy. Will it make people's lives better in the short run, and even maybe in the middle range of time? Yes, it will. Will most businesses be able to adjust to a higher salary scale? Yes, they will. They didn't have any problem. ExxonMobil didn't have any problem giving Lee Raymond, I think, a $342 million retirement package. So I'm not too worried about major companies being able to deal with that. Small businesses will have a little bit more problem to the degree that labor costs are a large part of their costs. But that said, what increase in minimum wage does is, in the short run, make people's lives better because they're better able to provide for their families. Does it change any of the fundamental problems in the broader economy? Probably not. And so, on the other hand, I think one has to recognize the political wisdom of President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who said, "Half a loaf is better than none." And the idea that somehow a policy change or a magic wand can be waved that will make everything wonderful in the economy forever and ever, not buying that. So when something improves people's lives and does so in a way that doesn't harm the country, it makes life better, I'm for that. So yes, but I recognize that reforms have are reforms. They're not. No single reform represents a fundamental change. It's an incremental change, but it's a welcome one. Other comments or questions? Okay, we're out of time. Next time we will start, tomorrow we'll start with foreign policy. Have a good day.
Yeah.